Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Hunter's joining me today. Hunter, I'm glad you're here.
Well, actually, I've uploaded all of our previous podcasts into ChatGPT, and it has created an AI persona of me, and so that's who is here today.
It sounds remarkably like you.
That's the genius of it.
That's
the genius of it. You're going to be seeing more of me everywhere, Autumn. I am using AI and this digital replica of myself to go viral, and so you're going to be seeing a lot more of me everywhere.
Unfortunately, your digital replica of yourself can't do the things like cut down the tree of heaven in your yard that we were talking about last week.
Hey, I'm glad you brought that up. I poisoned that tree just 4 days ago I bought this high-powered, herbicide, and I sawed into the base of the tree and squirted lots of this, and then I'm sitting here waiting, going, is it gonna? And yesterday I started to notice the thing is wilting a little bit, and I'm like, it's working.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Now it still looks healthy in a lot of ways, so we'll see if this actually works. But apparently you've got to poison it before you cut it down, because otherwise it will just send out new shoots of life before you get to it.
It's true. That's how it just keeps existing and taking over.
Yeah.
That's how the digital replicas of you are going to take over too, maybe.
That's right. That's right. You'll be looking for some digital poison.
To
eliminate
to
my
manage
AI
this
persona.
invasive species.
Yeah, my AI persona is going to be obnoxious.
Is that so? If you put all of your notes and sermons and whatever data about yourself you had into AI and it created this digital replica, that's what it came up with? Obnoxious? Bottom line?
Well, that's proof that I'm actually a living person here, because the AI would probably describe me more gently than that.
All right. Well, I'm glad you, the real you, is here with me today on the podcast. And we are taking on the topic of AI, which we're going to include in a few episodes throughout the fall. The topic of AI is huge, and it is one that I've been nervous to discuss because it feels like it's so hard to understand, to get my head around, and there's so many different angles on this topic that you can read about, that you can think about it from. But here we are. We're going to do it. We're going to start talking about it.
You found 2 articles in The Atlantic that we are going to use as a leaping off point, or maybe a foundation for our discussion on this episode. And as I read these 2 articles and started thinking of some of the implications in my own head of what they were saying, I started to get some clarity. And I felt that same nervousness that you are describing, of like, I have a little bit of a unease with where this technology is heading, and I'm reading things about that, but I can't quite put that into my own words. And these 2 articles helped me to do that. So I'm glad we're discussing them.
That's a great point, Hunter. The exercise of reading some articles, intentionally listening to some podcasts, and then going through the discipline of creating some notes, discussing this topic, and preparing for our episode today has helped me actually define some of that unease and put it into words. So that has been a really good process for me over these last couple of weeks. The 2 articles that we are going to discuss are really helpful, and they're raising important questions. And they helped me realize that the advent of AI, like a lot of new technologies, raise these existential questions that authors, thinkers, humans have had to ask time and time again. And as Christians, this moment should actually prompt us to look to God and to principles found in Scripture, to timeless truths, and to doctrines that help us respond to and navigate the use of AI in our workplaces, in our homes, our personal lives. I grabbed coffee with a friend a couple days ago, and she brought up in the course of conversation her unease with the way that her workplace is shifting into using AI and to requiring her as an employee to use it. And so this is a really relevant topic. And as we go through this process of asking how do we respond to and navigate this moment as Christians, I think these articles are helping us ask and then answer some of these big questions. So we're going to get into it then via these.
And I would add, unease is not the only thing I hear when I talk to my friends. I also talk to a lot of my friends about how it's affecting their work. And I am hearing some of that theme of unease, but I'm also hearing a theme of like, it is kind of amazing what you can do. And I'm hearing a theme of, hey, this is a tool that is coming and you're going to have to learn how to use it in your work. And in my industry, it's pretty much mandatory that we learn how to use this. So I'm hearing several themes. I do hear some unease. Sometimes I hear some amazement and some like, hey, this really makes things more efficient. We can accomplish a lot more. I sometimes hear the theme of inevitability, and this is just coming, kind of like on a previous episode, I described how computers, I was working at a time when computing power was being more and more used. So we're gonna have to layer in all of that, but let's I think these conversations are gonna lead us into the unease and integrating, paying attention to that unease and integrating that into our worldview, even if we think there's good potential for this technology, or even if we think I'm going to have to learn how to use it in my work. Integrating that unease, I think, is an important part of what we're going to have to do in the season ahead.
Well, these two articles, as you mentioned, were both in The Atlantic. The first is entitled, "There is Already a Word for the Deep Moral Failures of AI." And that was written by a staff writer for The Atlantic named Tyler Austin Harper. And the second, actually, in that first article, it refers to a couple of articles. And so this is one of the other articles that it links to. And this second article is called "The Pope Doubles Down on the Beautiful Struggle." And that's by another writer named Gal Beckerman. And in both of these articles, the writers are identifying something substantive that Christians bring to this conversation. And one, Tyler Austin Harper, in the course of his article, sort of refers to himself as a not very good Presbyterian. And that's not the exact word he uses, but a not very observant, maybe, Presbyterian. And then the other, Gal Beckerman, says he's not a Christian and not really much of a believer at all. And yet both are asking a question and ultimately landing on this realization that Christian thinkers have something unique to bring to the conversation about AI. And that is this fact that man is made in the image of God. So they're both realizing that secular society and science lack something in a full understanding of AI and in answering what are the dangers inherent in AI that we need to be aware of.
Well, that in and of itself is fascinating, that they are seeing that some Christian thinkers are having the clearest voice on this. And Tyler Austin Harper, in his article, refers to Pope Leo's encyclical, Magnificent Humanity, and also refers to a newer book by Carl Trueman called The Desecration of Man. And in both of those works, the authors are honing in on issues of anthropology, which is the question of what is man, man being a categorical term for men and women. What is mankind? What is humanity? And what is the essence of what it means to be human? And Tyler Austin Harper points out that much of the people who are developing AI technologies have a very fuzzy understanding of, or can't give a clear answer to what it means to be human, or they may even have a vision of humanity that says we can be replaced and we are replaceable, and our job is actually to create a successor species. That may be there in some of the people who are developing this. So he is pointing back to Christian sources. Interestingly, and this is a little bit of a side note, but Carl Trueman, I've read his book, and Carl Trueman does argue that the moral vision of Christianity is probably going to be attractive to a lot of people in the secular world, but he actually argues you can't just take the moral vision of Christianity and abstract it from the gospel itself and the worship. You need the whole package. And so I do think there's going to be a chance to say to people like Tyler Austin Harper and Gal Beckerman, to say to them and people like them, hey, it's great that you're noticing this unique contribution of Christian anthropology or the Christian moral vision. You actually need to consider the whole redemptive gospel of Jesus Christ. That's a little bit of a side note, but I think it's important for us to think about as we're navigating this.
In that article that you just referenced, Tyler Austin Harper points out that AI critics often talk about the dangers of AI in utilitarian terms. So perhaps the environmental impact or the loss of jobs. And what he's wrestling with is a deeper existential question. And he then says, even if all these concrete problems that he's referring to as these utilitarian discussions with AI were magically solved, if the environmental externalities were fixed, if better protections for workers were put in place, if artificial intelligence was not pressed into the service of war or surveillance or naked profit, these are all aspects of AI that we could discuss.
Yeah.
They're all real concerns. We would still be left with the technology that radically unsettles many traditional conceptions of human dignity and meaning and meaning, and that threatens to outsource the most interesting aspects of our life and labor to machines. And so he's wrestling with Tyler Austin Harper here in this article, and as we read his argument, he's trying to understand for himself and then to convey to his readers, what is it that makes humans uniquely human? And what is it that AI threatens that is something more or more significant even than environmental impacts or the loss of human life or the loss of work? And he's asking it then, he's reaching for these sources, as you said, like Truman and Pope Leo, to help him answer that question.
One of the things that my AI bot does is it takes pictures of or uses photographs of people on our staff team and turns them into funny memes. And it does that using artificial intelligence, and I've been doing that recently just as part of just having fun. And the response that comes back to me sometimes is like, how many trees had to die for you to make that silly picture of autumn? And
how many reservoirs are you drying up?
How many reservoirs am I drying up to make a silly picture of autumn? And what he's saying is, hey, there's actually another argument that's going to be more important than even if we eliminate the environmental concerns, so to speak. And it is I think an important question to think about, because when we are wrestling with moral issues, our temptation sometimes, even as followers of Jesus, is to try to translate the reason you should or shouldn't do this into purely pragmatic or utilitarian terms, meaning like, well, here's the direct impact of why or how it directly harms people or creation. And sometimes we just need to be able to say we shouldn't do that because it violates our nature as human beings. So if I'm talking to a man about why he shouldn't use pornography, and his argument is, well, it's not hurting anyone, and it's an outlet, for me. Part of what I need to be able to say is this in some way violates your fundamental design as a man made in God's image, and it violates other people's design, even if I can't directly trace a line of harm, so to speak. I can say, because this violates your nature, there will be all kinds of harmful implications, even if I can't directly name them, right in this very moment. And the thing that these authors are pointing to, that Christians talk about, is the image of God. We are created in the image of God. So that's the big point. I don't know how far we are into this podcast, but that's the big point. We just did what journalists call bury the lead. If I was writing this as a sermon, I would put that way up front. Like, we need to talk about the image of God, and what does it mean that human beings are made in the image of God, and how might artificial intelligence be causing us to imagine human beings as less than image bearers of God, and that will have all kinds of negative downstream effects, even if we can't directly tie it to, a reservoir that's drying up or a tree that got cut down.
Well, that sets up a question that these articles, these authors are asking that I think we should also ask. So why, as you were just describing, there's something about this whole topic about the advent of AI that threatens what it means to be human. And another way to ask that, a different angle on that same question, is how do humans uniquely image God? And what is it about artificial intelligence that threatens that? Why is it causing this unease for these writers too? Not just what we're hearing in our conversations or kind of sense in our own soul, but that these two authors are wrestling with.
And these articles help me see two things. Work is one of the ways we image God, and language is one of the ways we image God. Now, I feel like these articles help me think about that, even if they didn't name those two things specifically, because I did kind of experience as I read these, they're putting their finger on the image of God. Christianity says humans are created in the image of God. And then I kind of was like, okay, so what? So what does that mean, And I had to kind of think this out, but these articles helped me do that. And the two aspects, these aren't the only two aspects of imaging God, but the two aspects of how we image God that I think it's worth us thinking about is we were created to work in God's creation and to steward God's creation. And so our work, and I don't just mean that in terms of the jobs we go and get paid to do, but I mean all of our creative endeavor. Raising a child is work. Managing a home is work. Shopping for groceries is work. Mowing the lawn is work. Being a pastor of a church is work. Being an architect is work. So all of these things are work. In what ways does our work image God, and how does AI affect our relationship with work, and how might that be affecting how we imagine ourselves as image bearers of God? So that's the first one. And then I think the second one is language. God spoke the creation into existence. He created with his word, and he created us and put us in the world, and he gave us the capacity of language, which is creative. And artificial intelligence, and this might be what's new about the artificial intelligence as opposed to previous forms of computing power, is modeling human language and reproducing language. And so I think those are the two dimensions we ought to talk more about.
So in these two unique ways, Hunter, in terms of work and the way we were created, and language, which is a gift that we have that is reflective of the way that God himself interacts with us, the way that we know him and experience him, the way that he created. So this gift of language is something that is unique to humans, to humanity, that is distinctly reflective of the image of God, the way that we were made in the image of God. So let's go back to that question of work. You mentioned that humanity has faced this question before, this question of how work is going to be remade, and then how that actually begins to have a shaping effect on our humanity. So one of the time periods in the past that we can look to that this probably happened was the Industrial Revolution, when work was radically changed. And then probably again, maybe less so, but in the computing revolution. And so now we're in this era of the AI revolution. And so in what ways maybe is this similar or different than these previous time periods in history?
Well, I think it's similar in that it is remaking work. And I'm saying this because this is a nod to my friends who are saying, hey, we're seeing this allow us to do things in our work that we couldn't do previously, or it's able to take something that took 4 weeks to do previously and condense that time down to a couple of days or even a day. And so they're noticing efficiency gains in their work. And therefore they're saying this is essentially a very good technology to be using because it's giving us efficiency gains in our work. Now, that does have a displacing effect in that if it took 4 weeks to do something and it took one person 4 weeks to do it, and now it takes that one person a day to do it using AI tools, then you might only need one of those employees instead of 8 of them, right? And then we have to figure out, what are the other 7 going to do? with their time and with their work, and so it's going to have that effect. We've seen that before. That the Industrial Revolution caused that, and it changed a lot of people's work from being like work on the land, work with the physical creation, to being more managerial work that's managing others. A few others that are doing that kind of work. It massively changed some ways. In some places, the whole way a society was physically structured, like how many people live in the countryside and work in the countryside versus how many people live in the cities in apartments and in close quarters and are doing more managerial or technical kind of work. So huge change to the structure of society. And yet we survived that, and many would argue it brought great advances to the quality of human life. The Industrial Revolution did on a macro sense, even if it's displacive for a lot of people. Then we saw the computing revolution. Same dynamics at play. Computing made work a lot more efficient, and so I saw that in my accounting firm, where it used to take someone sitting down with a physical calculator and adding up numbers. Now you could put it all into a computer, and that computer would do it instantly and spit it out. And so something that took maybe 3 hours to do now takes 10 seconds. and so we had to learn to use this tool. It probably didn't eliminate a lot of jobs, but it did change a lot of the nature of those jobs. And if you couldn't learn to use that tool, if you insisted on using a calculator and adding up your tax returns by hand and by pencil, you just weren't going to be working anymore, right? Okay, so in that way, AI is a tool that we're putting to use to do computing kind of tasks, and they can do them super efficiently and replace a lot of human hours. So in that way, it's similar. In what way is it different, right? I think that's the question. If it's just changing work and making it more efficient, and it's a tool, and we've got to learn to use that tool, in what way is it different? But the first point I'm making is that is going to be disruptive to even just how we imagine ourselves as human beings, right? And it starts us to leading us down the path of asking questions like, are we unique as human beings? If computers, we can create computers that can do a lot of what we do, right? But I think the second way that AI is unique, or the way AI is unique, leads us to that second point, which is language. And in this way, it's different than previous technological advances. Previous advances in computing technology were mainly around calculation and gave us tools to use our language to project that language in more efficient ways. So think about how much more efficient it was to use a word processor on your computer than to use a typewriter. You're still using language. You're doing the same basic task of using your words, crafting words, but now it's easier to edit your words. The process of revision is quicker. You can broadcast them more easily because you don't just have printed pages that you made in a typewriter. You now have digital copies that you can distribute, but the nature of the task is still the same. The computer is serving the purpose of me putting my words, out into the world, right? And computers were great at calculating things, doing numbered kind of tasks. Where AI is different, it's even in the name, language learning models. It is learning from human-produced language, and it's reproducing that language such that we are now creating linguistic products that we put out in the world that we didn't have a direct involvement in creating. We had more of an indirect involvement. And so we're reviewing sometimes, or maybe we're just putting out language products that we didn't have a direct involvement in creating. And I think there is something about the image of God that's lost when language things are being put out there that a person, either the person of the Lord Jesus Christ or the person of Autumn and Hunter or Autumn and Jesse or people, didn't have a direct involvement in creating. I think that's changing the nature of how we conceive of ourselves.
Yeah, you mentioned the word creating. That is one of the questions I see being raised in this conversation over and over with language learning models. Not only are they able to generate a word-based document or to help write a paper or to help craft a sermon, and I say help, but actually AI is able to do that. It has enough inputs to generate those things. And so one of the questions I see raised in this whole discussion of what is uniquely a human made and where do these lines become fuzzy, is that question of creativity. And one of the authors, Gal Beckerman, in his article, actually brings this up from a different sort of perspective, from the perspective of human limitation. But he mentions, I think, one of the novels that you recently read and talked about, Hunter, as an illustration of how he's thinking through this. Do you know what quote I'm talking about? Do you want to read that for us?
Yeah, here's what he writes. I will always prefer reading a novel written by a human precisely because I know the limitations placed on a human brain. The opportunity to commune with such a brain, one that has pushed against those boundaries to create Middlemarch, is 1,000 times more fulfilling than reading what a purportedly boundless machine has produced. Now, I think what he's saying that's really important there is, when I read George Eliot's novel Middlemarch, and I know that George Eliot, was a human
Marianne
being.
Evans.
Yeah, Marianne Evans. Yeah, sorry. That's why she's a she,
That's
George.
why she's a she.
Yeah, she's a human being. And so she had to grapple with all of these dimensions of the human psyche and how human beings relate to each other in order to even create these characters that I'm reading about and I'm relating to and I'm rooting for or I'm cheering against, in Middlemarch. So there's a sense in which I am communing with her. I am entering into her space, her brain, which I'm not doing if I'm reading something produced by AI. I'm not communing with another human being. I think about. I've recently been reading a book by J.I. Packer on the Puritans. I won't make it into a Vision for Life book club, but it's fantastic. And I have this feeling like J.I. Packer passed away a few years ago. I have this feeling of like, man, I am benefiting from the wisdom of this man, and I'm entering into his heart and soul as he's sharing that, in this book. You don't have that when you're interacting with AI. So he's saying this is why he prefers reading a novel written by a human, because he understands human limits. Okay, then he goes on. The same could be said for any number of other areas of life, dating, traveling, working, in which the friction is what produces meaning. That's a fascinating observation. The friction of having to push against the limits of our intelligence, of our understanding, of even our capacity to relate to people, that friction and pushing against gives meaning or gives uniqueness or gives specialness to something we do and create, that if you eliminate all that friction through AI, and that's really what it does, it eliminates friction, makes things easier, something is lost. He says, for an algorithm, an error is a flaw to be corrected, Pope Leo writes. For a person, however, an error can be a catalyst for profound change.
Maybe a practical encouragement here for us and for our listeners then is to spend some time thinking about how AI and each of our interactions with AI or use of AI are impacting our work. And you explained earlier, Hunter, that is work broadly. So not only paid work or work that you do as a career, but how it's impacting the way you live and work in God's world and your understanding of and participation in work as stewarding God's creation. And then particularly how it is impacting our work in terms of language, use of language, creating, particularly this aspect of creating and what it means to create. So those would be things to continue to think on after this. And I invite always questions. So if you continue to think on this topic and have a question that raises for you, send it to us. Let us know.
I'm glad you put that little practical conclusion on it, because I do think that would be my challenge to all of our listeners, is think about how AI is affecting particularly your communication and language work. And part of that could just be drawing some boundaries. For like, I have basically drawn a boundary for myself. I will use AI to do research. It's great to ask it questions. Hey, summarize, this story or that story. I found it helpful in that sense. I will not.
And to combine a picture of, you'll use it also to combine a picture of our communications director, Olivia, with Liberace, and to create Liberace.
Liberace, yeah.
You will do that.
That's easy work, But I'm not going to let it do language creation work for me. It is not going to write my sermons. It's not going to respond to an email. It is not going to write even a newsletter blurb for me. I have found with some of my writing to craft it and drop it into AI and get maybe some editing, feedback can be helpful. It can help me see some things where maybe I've been a little clumsy in what I've said. Even that, though, if you just take what it edits, it doesn't sound like a human. Mm-hmm. But it's not gonna do language creation work for me. And I want to even be able to tell people, hey, I would rather deliver a sermon that is a B and a little disorganized than a sermon that is perfectly organized A+, but was created by AI. Because I want you to be hearing from me directly as the pastor. So I'm never gonna enter a prompt into ChatGPT to say, I'm preaching Psalm 107 this week, and I want to bring out these 4 dimensions of the psalm. And by the way, I've uploaded 500 of my previous sermons, so you kind of know what my voice is, and you know all my Meemaw stories, so pick the ones that are most relevant, and give me a sermon, with 3 points and 3 illustrations, and it could do that. And then I could take that, and I could probably take the draft of that, and I could maybe get a little outline from it and put a little polish on it, and I could deliver that. That would remove me from the communication with the church that I pastor in a way that I'm not willing to go to. And I want to give people that assurance. You're not going to hear AI me preaching to you. And you're not, if you read something that I wrote, it was not written by AI. It was written by me. And that's why, even if it sounds clumsy and you're like, what did he mean? You could just assume that that's my human frailty and limitation, and not because it's slop.
I appreciate the differentiation you are making there, Hunter, and the acknowledgement that in your particular role, using yourself as an example, that the gift of language, which is so tied into the work you do as a pastor, is something that you are, I see how, as you're sharing that, you have been thinking through this, and you have come to a conclusion that that gift of language that God has given us, has given you, and the use of it in your unique role is important. It's something important to guard, to make sure that you are using your voice in a way that carries power. And there's a direct connection to Scripture, but also to the way God has designed you, and then the role that you inhabit.
Yeah, and I've also been thinking about Andy Crouch's book Playing God. As I've been thinking through this, he talks about at several points the tendency of pastors, but all of us, to present ourselves as superhuman, like we're doing more than we really are. And I think AI represents that temptation. Like, here's a practical example. I had a month of vacation and downtime, and I have a newsletter I write weekly, but I haven't written it for basically June and July because I wanted to have a summer break. And I could totally have asked AI to generate me eight weekly articles on these subjects, and I could have just posted those up to my newsletter, and then it would look like Hunter just writes an article every week. But what I would be doing there is presenting a version of me that is in some ways a lie. It presents me as having greater capacity to produce and to write than I really have as a human being. And so I just wanted to say, no, I'm a limited human being. I can't crank something out every week, especially on weeks that I'm on vacation, and that's okay. And I would rather have some readers unsubscribe because they haven't heard from Hunter in 8 weeks, then I would like present a false image.
That's the reality of human limitation is one thing that was mentioned in the quote that you read from the article by Gal Beckerman. And I'm going to direct our attention back to the articles for just a moment. In the article by Tyler Austin Harper, if I were to sum it up in the central question that Harper is asking and wrestling with, there's this recognition that AI threatens what it means to be human. And then in that article, Harper is asking, but what does it mean to be human? And acknowledging that secular thinkers come up short in being able to answer this question. And so then he directs our attention to, as you said, Truman and Pope Leo, and a recognition that humans are created, made in the image of God. And then in the second article that we mentioned by Gal Beckerman, Beckerman comes to a similar wrestling point and then also says, but if AI threatens what it means to be human, or if we're going to lose something of our humanity because of artificial intelligence, then what is worth saving about being human? And he answers this by saying, well, basically the divine spark, which is the Imago Dei, or some version of like this indefinable aspect of consciousness and sentience, and that he's calling the divine spark. And then he says fallibility or limitedness is actually one of the unique things about being human that AI threatens. And then beauty. And so I'm going to read another quote from his article as an illustration here of how he's defining what is threatened by AI. And he says, this is an element of Leo's argument. He is, after all, head of the Catholic Church. So he's referring here to Pope Leo's encyclical. But he also makes clear that humanity, as he describes it, that is, as Pope Leo describes it, should be exalted because of its woundedness just as much as its grandeur. Our limitations are the key to understanding what makes humans special. We must remember that humanity flourishes not despite limitations, but often through them, writes Pope Leo. And then Gal Beckerman weighs in with this statement. You don't even need to believe in God to appreciate that our uniqueness derives from the friction produced by our vulnerability, suffering, and failure. To smooth out this roughness would be to get rid of what is most essential about us. And so I want to come back to, because I think that quote illustrates something that you mentioned before, Hunter. And you said in Truman's book, so you made this reference to Carl Truman's book, which I think you're talking about his new book, The Desecration of Man. In his book, he talks about the moral vision of Christianity being appealing to some secular thinkers right now. And that's what I see displayed in these two articles. But you, and I think you were referencing Truman, but you also were offering a warning about that, Hunter. So I wanted to bring our conversation back to that because I think it is worth noticing that there's something in the Christian moral vision for life that is very appealing. And we see this displayed in these two articles, and probably we can point to other places too, but it's clear here. Beckerman especially is acknowledging that he's not a Christian, and yet there's something about this Christian moral vision that helps him answer these existential questions, and he can't find the answer anywhere else. But he still wants to answer those questions without the necessity of belief.
Yeah, and I think I want to say here, to get the full glory of human nature back, and I'm using glory intentionally because man is an image bearer of God. And so human nature is glorious, not in the way God is glorious, not in a way that should be worshipped, but in a way that is weighty. And that's really what glory means, and should be respected. To get the full glory of human nature back, we have to be redeemed. And there's a saying that we sometimes pass around, and it's a good one. Grace restores nature. Grace, the grace of God, redeems us back into God's original vision for humanity, and it restores human nature. And without redemption, we do not get the fullness of human nature back. And so I do want to push back on people who are like, "Hey, I like the Christian moral vision. You don't have to believe in God to see the truth in that." I'm glad that we find common ground there, but I also want to say, hey, we need grace. We need the grace of God. We need atonement for sin because we can't save ourselves. We need to be restored into relationship with God. That is part of what it means to bear His image. We need the new birth and the impartation of new life from the inside out in order to be restored to the fullness of our humanity. And by the way, that doesn't make us unlimited creatures, right? Like in the pre-lapsarian, before the fall, in the Garden of Eden, man and woman were limited to, they had to live by trust and by faith in the Word of God. They were not omnicompetent, finite people. Even if they were not mortal, or they were not going to die until they sinned. So you can be totally free from sin and still limited and finite. Now we're not going to get there in before the resurrection, but I just want to say we need redemption in order to have the fullness of humanity, and we may need to say that more often in this era where people are wondering what it even means to be human. Is, hey, what this is pointing us to is man has created a technology that diminishes man, and what man ultimately needs to not be diminished is to be redeemed. And we are redeemed by the perfect man, Jesus Christ, who atones for our sin, who gives us resurrection life, who imparts it through new birth. And that's what it means to be fully human.
Thanks for that reminder, Hunter. There's this interesting paradox at the heart of what you were just saying, in that man has created a technology that threatens to diminish what it means to be man, and at the same time it promises a sort of limitlessness. And that was present in the scene that you just referred to in the garden. Part of the temptation that they faced was to be like God. That was part of the serpent's promise to them, that they could attain a sort of limitlessness by rejecting God. And I think that lies still present and inherent in this new technological revolution that we are living through. So I appreciate you summarizing it in that way. If our listeners wanted to read, we've mentioned a couple of times this Carl Trueman book. So if our listeners want to read more about a biblical anthropology to understand this vision of being made in the image of God and how various technological forces actually can threaten that, among other things, the subtitle of that book that I was referencing is How the Rejection of God Degrades Our Humanity. So is this a book you would recommend,
Absolutely.
Hunter? I think another that came to my mind is The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, which is older but covers similar ground. Hunter, I'm so grateful that we have jumped into this topic. I don't know if my nervousness is eased at all, but I did appreciate the chance to talk with us.
Well, I have another great article that I read this week about a pastor creating an AI persona of himself, which is kind of why I just worked that into the intro. So we'll have to take that one up in a future episode.
All right, we will do that. If you are reading articles that you find interesting, whether about artificial intelligence or other topics that you think would make for good content on the Vision for Life podcast, send those our way, along with any questions that you may have. We love doing Q&R episodes every so often, so we hope to hear from you. You can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam England for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.